A little bit about The Trace. We're a nonprofit journalism organization focused exclusively on guns and gun violence. Our team has been dedicated to this beat for more than a decade. So, why are we here today? Throughout America's history, our relationship to guns has been a defining force and has been at the center of debates around life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're not here today for a debate, but a conversation about how we arrived here, the role guns have played in shaping America's past, and what the future might look like. Leading today's conversation is the Trace's managing director, James Burnett, our founding editor when we launched in 2015. His current role is to lead the team's strategic growth and sustainability. His background includes leadership roles at Boston Magazine, New York Magazine, and the New Republic. Our panelists today are Jamelle Bouie, a columnist covering history and politics for the New York Times. He began his career at the American Prospect magazine and also spent time as a writer for the Daily Beast. In addition, he co-hosts the Unclear and Present Danger podcast on the political and military thrillers of the 1990s. Many here probably know him from his TikTok and Instagram presence. Our other panelist is Adam Winkler, a specialist in American constitutional law, the Supreme Court, and gun policy at the UCLA School of Law. He is the author of Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America, and has been cited in landmark Supreme Court cases on the First and Second Amendments. His writing and commentary have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and on CNN, NPR, and Face the Nation. James, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you, Jamelle and Adam, for your time, for being part of this conversation today. As the event title says, we're here to talk about 250 years of guns in America. We have 57 more minutes in which to do so. Really, to engage with this topic is to take on two really conflicting narratives. On the one hand, there's the American Revolution, the shot heard around the world. And from that, this idea that guns are essential for freedom, that gun ownership is itself patriotic. In this view, guns are for security, but they can also be a way to claim individual power. People who hold that perspective point out that the civil rights leaders who embraced firearms. Ida B. Wells' Winchester, Fannie Lou Hamer's shotguns, the Black Panthers, and the revolvers and military surplus rifles. To this day, supporters of gun rights share stories of people who defend themselves with guns when the government failed to protect them. There is, of course, a flip side. Guns have been used to silence people who fought oppression. Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, and on and on. We've had Kent State, more recently, ICE agents shooting protesters in Minneapolis. Before that, Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha. The January 6th rioters included members of militias formed in part by their opposition to gun regulation of any kind. Guns in this framework assert one group's rights over others and enable a tyranny of a political minority. So to kick us off, Jamelle, Adam, how should we understand the net effect of guns on our democracy?
I guess I'll start. First, thank you for having us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's a hard question to answer, James, because I think your lead up kind of captures the contradiction, which is that throughout American history, gun ownership, the use of guns has been something that for people on the margins of society has allowed them to, or been one of the things that allowed them to claim membership into the larger polity, right? You think about Black Americans in the aftermath of the Civil War who take gun ownership seriously as a statement of their belonging as full citizens, as well as a way to protect themselves from white vigilantes and the like. And then on the other end, and this is sort of tied into it, guns do mark status, right? They mark who is able to belong, and they have been symbols of kind of a status hierarchy that only certain particular Americans are allowed to own guns. And in their hands, guns stand for, freedom of a sort, stand for domination of others, stand for kind of independence and liberty and the like. Um, and it's hard then to say make a definitive claim about what guns mean. I think that in this moment, the meaning of guns is, for I think many Americans, something that threatens liberty broadly understood, not simply, and you spoke to those Americans who see gun ownership as part and parcel of being free. But then for I think a lot of people, living in a world of mass shootings and the like, that they understand that as a limit on their freedom, as a limit on their liberty. And for them, some attempt to regulate guns thus becomes the pathway to experiencing a freer America. But again, there's this, it's kind of a built-in contradiction, because even today you'll find plenty of people who not for who for good reasons say gun ownership is important for me to be able to like defend my liberty as someone who is on the margins of society. So I think that the gun as an object, as a symbol, um, it contains this like central contradiction, and I don't think it's ever really been resolved.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the relationship between democracy and guns is quite complicated. As James, as you mentioned, right, we gained our democracy in part through the use of guns. The founders were armed revolutionaries who took up arms against their government in an effort to assert their liberties, to defeat tyranny, and it's for all the debates over the exact scope and meaning of the Second Amendment, it's pretty clear that the founders thought that at least the federal government should never be able to completely disarm the states and the people within them, in part because they thought that was central to preserving democracy. And as Jamelle points out, we've seen groups in society who've sought to possess firearms to preserve their liberty and their voice in democracy. You mentioned my book Gunfight, and in that book I talk about the Black Panthers. And while Martin Luther King and some aspects of the civil rights movement really sought for preserve nonviolence as a way of promoting the rights of African Americans and their voice in democracy, the Black Panthers and Malcolm X and others in the movement took up arms as a way of insisting that their rights were inviolate, and that if people tried, especially the police, tried to take away their rights and to oppress them, that they would fight back. And in an armed society, obviously, there's no better way to fight back, or more effective way, perhaps, to fight back than being armed yourself. But we've also seen throughout American history guns used to limit the voice of the people. The Colfax Massacre in 1873, when over 100 black men seeking to preserve their votes were slaughtered by KKK members and former Confederate soldiers in Louisiana, is one of the more dramatic examples of people being slaughtered by guns in order to diminish their ability to exercise their right to vote and their voice in democracy. And even today, we see that guns can be and are sometimes used to intimidate voters. People showing up at near polling places with arms to try to prevent people who might exercise the right to vote from doing so. And that's in part why we have long-standing laws prohibiting guns in polling places and sometimes right around them. One aspect of democracy and guns that's worth recognizing today, regardless of the history, is how the Supreme Court has recently expanded the Second Amendment and taken to overturning more and more gun laws. We had a gun law overturned earlier this week. It's likely we'll see the Supreme Court overturn another one next week. And this expansion of the Second Amendment comes at the expense of democracy, in the sense that it makes it harder for we, the people, to choose gun laws as a way to promote public safety. So this relationship is complicated, and it is dynamic as well.
You talk about those Supreme Court decisions. We also have the Trump Justice Department's Civil Rights Division is bringing suit against cities and states to overturn state and local gun laws. That, in a sense, is an outgrowth of an idea expressed by supporters of gun rights that the Second Amendment has been treated as a second class right somehow, that it is subordinate and always, in danger. And that belief is there even as you pointed out, as you both point out, um, contemporary gun laws around open carry, et cetera, right? They have been used to um, suppress speech or certainly challenge it of opposing groups, even pose a threat to the right to assembly. I think back to COVID, right? And, an armed group stormed the Michigan legislature to try to overturn COVID restrictions. Of course, although not many guns are present at the Capitol on January 6th to evoke that again, there's strong overlap there. How do we get this idea that, even as we see all the effects of the Second Amendment as currently interpreted, it is seen somehow as a second class or subordinate right that needs to be more vigorously asserted and defended?
Yeah, I myself am not entirely certain where this notion comes from. I mean, if anything, the I'd say radical expansion of individual gun rights threatens to sort of consume other rights. As you've
Right.
already kind of alluded to, how much does your right to assembly, how much does your right to speech mean if you can be essentially menaced by, people wielding weapons and, states are powerless to do anything about that. Like that to me that seems like an elevation of individual gun rights above other concerns, or rather saying that there's no balancing that needs to attend how we think about the individual right to bear arms. Even though we do think about how we should balance rights to free speech against other concerns, rights to assembly against other concerns, even rights to religion, freedom of worship, to other concerns. The Second Amendment seems to be the one right, as is currently understood, for which there is a rejection of the notion that it has to be balanced against any other concerns. The other thing I'd add here is that I don't know how much we're going to get into like thinking about the current court's jurisprudence on gun rights, but my view is that the current interpretation of the Second Amendment rests on basically an anachronism. It's like reading back into the 18th century, a notion of first rights being primarily textual, they flow from the text, of rights being primarily individual and not collective, and of liberty being primarily something of non-interference and not of liberty being tied to proper representation. That leads you to this place where you read the Second Amendment as creating an individual right to own guns that can't be infringed by anyone. Whereas I think you can make a very good case that founding era Americans, early Republic Americans, would have seen the Second Amendment as affirming, right, a collective right to firearm ownership for the purposes of securing a free state. I think that securing a free state is actually like maybe the most important set of words in that amendment. But then also they would have understood that like how that right plays out is sort of it plays out in terms of ordinary governance, and that laws, right, local laws, for example, that would restrict where you could carry weapons, that would put regulations on how you have to maintain and store weapons. These things wouldn't have been understood as an infringement on the right, and to the extent that they're understood as infringement on the right today seems to be like really reading a very contemporary and modern notion of rights back into the past, in ways that just sort of like doesn't. I mean, as I think we can see, it produces very odd outcomes where you can't, um, courts struggle, right, are now struggling with laws that aim to keep guns out of the hands of people who have been shown to be public menaces. And this just wouldn't have been a controversial thing 200 years ago.
Yeah, I
Adam,
mean,
you've written about, go ahead, you've written about that era, I was going to say, and help us understand how those founding laws, the laws of present at the founding, evolved to what we would see, more recently.
sure. I mean, you asked about that idea of a second class right, that the Second Amendment was a second class right, and that was given voice to by the U.S. Supreme Court, the justices like Justice Thomas, Justice Alito and others, when the Supreme Court refused to step in and overturn gun laws. And part of the idea was that the court had declared that there was a Second Amendment individual right to keep and bear arms in the Heller case back in 2008. But then over the next 12 years or so, just didn't really strike down very many gun laws and didn't seem that interested in taking a very close, skeptical examination of gun laws. And so they were saying this was a second class right. And this itself is, I think, a manifestation of a social movement for gun rights that we've had in this country. The Supreme Court didn't just recognize the right to keep and bear arms out of nowhere. It was the result of one of the most effective social movements of the 20th century. We often recognize how social movements reshape constitutional law, the civil rights movement and Brown versus Board of Education, the women's rights movement and Roe versus Wade, the gay rights movement and Obergefell versus Hodges. But there's also been a movement for gun rights. And ever since the Cincinnati Revolt of 1977, when hardliners took over the NRA, gun rights advocates have been a really key part of the GOP coalition that elected presidents from Reagan to Trump, each of whom promised to protect gun rights. And Trump appointed 3 justices to the court, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, all of whom had very strong pro-gun, anti-gun regulation bona fides. And so this idea that there needed to be more teeth to the Second Amendment was really the ultimate aim and result of a real social movement for gun rights in America. Certainly, in terms of how you ask about gun laws and how they've changed, it's important to recognize that both gun rights have been a staple of American law, but so has gun control. For all the debates over the Second Amendment, state constitutions have long protected and guaranteed an individual right to have firearms for personal protection. So even if the court got it wrong in Heller, the right to keep and bear arms is a very well preserved right and recognized right in American constitutional law. And there are state constitutional law cases on this dating back to the 1820s. And today, 42 of the 50 states guarantee an individual right to bear arms in their own state constitutions. But we often forget that gun control has been a staple of American law too. Many in the gun rights movement emphasize, well, what's the idea of shall not be infringed? Means we shouldn't have gun laws. But of course, the founders had gun laws, such as restrictions on guns in the hands of slaves and free blacks, loyalists to England's Indians. The Wild West, the heart of American gun culture, had some of the most restrictive gun laws in the nation. And over the course of the 20th century, laws became widespread that banned guns to felons, the mentally ill, and prohibited most people from carrying guns in public. Many of those laws have been reversed in recent years as a result of that broader social movement for gun rights.
We take for granted now the party alignment, the political party alignment around this issue, where Democrats, and I think this has become increasingly uniform, right? Favor more restrictions, and Republicans favor more gun rights. It also seems to be the case, though, that zooming out globally, right-wing governments are not always in favor of a heavily armed populace. So I was wondering if you can help us understand what it is about sort of American conservatism that gravitates toward this particular right, again, seen as an individual right.
I think I would make two arguments. One sort of is just kind of straightforward political coalitions, and the second is maybe a little bit more, abstract. The first is that, in addition to this gun rights movement that found a place within the Republican Party, major supporters of the Republican Party are just gun manufacturers, the people who just produce guns, right? And there's a pretty straightforward sort of like interest alignment there, right? Like these people are supporters. They do not want to see big restrictions on gun ownership because that cuts into profits made by gun manufacturers. The NRA, quite like notably, is an organization that very much represents gun manufacturers. And the fact that gun manufacturers are like reliable supporters of Republican candidates, of Republican Party organizations, I think contributes to sort of the willingness not to cross them too often. In the same way that the fact that like hospital medical device manufacturers are like reliable supporters of Democratic candidates because they're kind of tend to be concentrated in places like Massachusetts and Washington State, and that like shapes how Democratic politicians think about the regulation of medical devices. So I think there's that element to it. It's a very kind of straightforward. This is what politics looks like interest group politics. But I'd also say that the American conservative movement, which comes into its own in the 1970s, which is very much part of a reaction against the women's rights movement or the rights revolutions of the 60s and the 70s, that sees the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, and the gay rights movement as fundamentally overturning kind of received hierarchies in American life. The conservative movement, I think, has been invested in this notion of um, restoring to proper prominence, you might say, like the authority and the status of white men. And in just American culture, the gun is tied up in that as well. When you look at kind of the publications, the magazines, whatever, around the gun rights movement, what you see are tropes about white men defending their home from, um, you know, criminals. Often, you don't have to say racially defined, but like clearly racially defined. Magazines like Soldier of Fortune, which no longer exist, but back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, 90s, very much presented gun ownership and mastery of the gun as part of mastery of one's home, mastery of one's society, sort of this notion of mastery of the master. And all these are tied up into sort of conceptions of white masculinity that I think have a lot of traction within, American movement conservative politics. That you see, I mean, you see, these ideas, they're present in the current government, right? If you follow the Twitter page for the Department of Homeland Security, they're always posting basically this kind of propaganda centered on this kind of these ideas about white masculinity and status hierarchy. Um, and so, why are American conservatives pro-gun? I mean, some of it's just like the nation's history and heritage. Some of it's interest group politics, but I think some of it is just like the particular social world that uh, conservatives have tried to build, um, dovetails quite nicely with sort of these received notions of what gun ownership means.
And I agree with what Jamelle says generally, especially on the cultural side. I guess I would register at least some small dissent on the idea um, that gun makers, gun manufacturers are really key to the expansion of the right to vote and protection of voting rights. Gun companies actually are not generally super profitable. We've seen several of them go into bankruptcy recently. They don't spend a ton of money on lobbying. The NRA is a voice for gun companies in the sense that they have advertisements from the gun companies in their magazines. But I think the strength of the gun rights movement comes from voters, from individuals who really feel that this is the single issue upon which they should base their vote. And there's a lot of them, single issue pro gun voters in America, and they're spread throughout a number of states. Most states in the union have a very strong coalition of single issue pro gun voters. And they make this the basis of their vote in primary campaigns, in general election campaigns. And we see that even today with the NRA at a historically weak and a historically weak status as a result of the upheaval that they've faced over the last few years, the lawsuits, the firing of Wayne LaPierre, et cetera. We still see that gun rights remain incredibly strong because the NRA gains its strength not because it spends money, although it does do that, but because it represents a large number of single issue pro gun voters. If you want to see the gun debate change You need to see the rise of single issue pro gun control voters, and we don't see that. I remember after the Sandy Hook shooting, and there was a big push by the Obama administration for some new gun legislation, either universal background checks or restrictions on military style rifles. And senators talked about how while people, if you looked at polling numbers, 80 to 90% of people favored these reforms, but the senators would report that calls into their offices were 10 to 1 against these proposals. And what that suggested to them was that the really intense voters, the people who are going to base their exercise of their vote on this issue, were strongly opposed to these new laws. And I think that understanding the strength of the gun rights movement is much more a function of understanding the strength of single issue pro gun voters than, say, lobbying by gun manufacturers.
You hear in a more recent legislative debate over the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, right after the Buffalo and Uvalde shootings, you hear, and this is certainly the narrative put forward by folks on the gun violence prevention side, that the intensity gap closed somewhat, right? That there was a sense among the Republican Senate caucus, Mitch McConnell specifically, that the party had to give a little. But I want to actually talk about the Democratic Party for a second. And I was thinking about Graham Plattner, right? And this could become a Graham Plattner event. Let's not do that. But I was thinking of Plattner as somebody who is a gun owner, right? And proudly so, and sort of challenges the party orthodoxy on that. I think back to Bernie Sanders' run for president and the way that his record in Vermont on guns, where he was sort of following like state culture and norms, was not outright or absolutely opposed to gun control laws, but was, certainly open to a more expansive view of gun rights given norms and traditions in Vermont. But that's used against him to try to say he's not like with us, with Democrats on this. Can Democrats accomplish their policy aims on guns, on gun violence prevention, without building a bigger tent or broader coalition on guns?
It's interesting. I think at this stage, the Democratic Party has largely given up on trying to pass expansive gun legislation or any kind of serious gun restrictions. I think that in practice, like of the things that people are upset with Graham Plattner about, no one said anything about the fact that he is like relatively pro-gun, right? Like it just doesn't register
Right.
to people. I think that there's been an acceptance of the fact that for trying to rebuild party strength in predominantly rural states, you just have to let people adopt state views on guns and run with it. And even at the national level, there is a real hesitancy to really be seen embracing any kind of gun restrictions. Um, so I sort of think that, like, on guns, the institutional Democratic Party has basically like retreated quite a bit, precisely for the dynamics that Adam identifies. I think that the battle at this moment is actually about the ability of states and localities to choose their own um, gun regulations. Like that's where the court's jurisprudence um, is the biggest obstacle, because I think that for a lot of Americans, if you said, ask them how should people think about gun rights, or how should the regulation of guns go? I think most Americans think there should be some regulation. I would say most Americans would probably say it should be like state dependent, locality dependent, because places are different. New York City probably wants different kind of gun laws than even places in upstate New York. Uh, and the extent to which it is difficult to do that, sort of have state by state, um, locality by locality gun restrictions. I think that is maybe the larger, at this point, like the real political challenge. I'm not sure that you'll see like a Democratic presidential candidate in 2028 call for like an assault weapons ban. Like I just don't think it's going to happen. Um, and I think that a candidate who did call for it would find themselves like criticized pretty heavily for the threat that poses to trying to win over voters. I think the bigger issue is if you are if you are a Democrat in like an urban area, an urban state, and you think that your state should be able to have, gun regulations that the majority of people in your political community support, there's a good chance that the court's jurisprudence means that you can't. And it's the creation of kind of a gun right like a universal floor for or ceiling actually for the extent of gun restrictions you can have that I think is like the real political issue for Democrats at the very least.
Hmm.
I was just going to say that, this is an issue that the Democratic Party has really struggled with and gone back and forth with over the years. I remember in 2008, I was writing my book on the Second Amendment, and I remember Barack Obama was running for president, and he really didn't talk about gun control much. He occasionally talked about reasonable regulation, but for the most part, he talked about the importance of respecting the right to bear arms, in part because at the time, it was the received wisdom among Democrats that they needed to win over those rural swing state voters that had seemingly abandoned the Democratic Party, and that this was an issue that was pushing them away from the Democratic Party. And then we saw a big change in the Democratic Party in the wake of the sort of the wave of mass shootings we saw that really sort of started to capture American public attention at Shady Hook in Connecticut, that massacre. We saw, for instance, in the 2020 campaign, Democratic presidential candidates almost falling all over each other to articulate more expansive gun control proposals. And the Democratic Party platform included a number of them, including things like banning military-style assault weapons. That sort of has waned a little bit in the 24 campaign and likely to continue to wane. One of the problems there, again, is why spend your time pushing for gun safety regulation if the Supreme Court's going to overturn it? But we have seen the creation of and a voice of more of a gun control movement in the Democratic Party than we saw, for instance, 20 years ago. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see in the next presidential election what role that movement, Moms Demand Action, for instance, plays in the Democratic Party. One thing is for sure certain, which is that with this current Supreme Court, any kind of significant gun regulation that you could get adopted would likely face incredible scrutiny and anything innovative likely to be overturned.
So there's obviously there's the electoral calculus, right? As presidential candidates, statewide candidates, other national Democrats stake positions on this issue. There's the judicial calculus of whether anything you pass can withstand a legal challenge that gets taken up by the court. But I wonder, coming back to the theme of democracy, if you can help us understand the kind of the message that is sent when mass shootings occur and keep occurring, and the public sees, by and large, our federal government not do anything, not do all that much. I'll say all that much because I'll grant that the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act did have some, valuable provisions in it. Setting aside mass shootings, just looking at rates of community violence, right? Looking at neighborhoods where gun violence is endemic. How the government's inability or failure to solve that, what kind of reaction that might breed or cause among the electorate, right, among people to see these bad things happen and government not sufficiently respond.
Yeah, I mean, I happen to think that the failure to respond to mass shootings in particular um, has really done a number on the public's trust in government, trust that the Congress in particular can do anything. Um, you know, the fact that like we could offer all kinds of explanations, right? And we have for the fact that for why it is that even as 80 to 90% of Americans support universal background checks, that kind of legislation struggles to get by in Congress, right? We know why that's the case. We have our explanations. But for the typical person who just sort of like doesn't pay that much attention to politics, and sees a headline that says 80% of Americans, 90% of Americans support this thing, and then they read a headline the next day that Congress tried to pass it and it failed, I think that creates a sense of futility, a sense that sort of like it doesn't really matter. That if the government cannot come together to um, pass something that everyone seems to want, well, how can I trust it to do anything even reasonably more difficult? How can I trust it to do anything? And I think that the years after Sandy Hook, um, in the mass shootings during those years and the way that there seemed to be no particular federal response to them has engendered a lot of cynicism about the political system. There's a reason. There's a reason that whenever a shooting does happen, people mock the notion of sending thoughts and prayers, right? Like it's just a common reaction now to mock the idea that you would um, respond to this by a solemn a solemn note about how sad you are that it happened, especially coming from politicians. Because I think there's an assumption that, what does it matter? They're not going to do anything substantive to deal with it. And that bleeds over into all kinds of other things related to government, other things related to politics. I think it really is genuinely corrosive that um, Americans experienced basically like a decade of regular mass shootings, and then there was no federal response.
Yeah, part of the problem though is how do you solve something like mass shootings in a society that has 400 million guns in it? I think that we think about universal background checks or bans on military style assault rifles as responses to these problems, but I kind of think of them as kind of, sort of they're pots of gold at the end of the rainbow that might solve your financial problems, but there's a hitch that there's no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. We're not going to disarm the American people. There's 400 million guns in America. Gun owners are never going to give them up. Banning guns, if we could find the political will to do it, would be like banning alcohol or drugs. Prohibition was a complete failure. The war on drugs wasn't very successful either, fueling black market and increased crime rather than reducing those things. The guns are here to stay, and in a world of 400 million guns, universal background checks or restrictions on military style rifles is not going to end mass shootings. The majority of mass shootings occur with a simple handgun, which is obviously not going to be restricted anytime soon. So part of the problem is we do define mass shootings are obviously a problem. But it's hard to imagine what's the gun law, what kind of legislation could you pass that's going to prevent them. Unfortunately, probably the kind of reforms that are going to do the most to limit mass shootings is increased security. And coming down, creating a kind of lockdown nation where you have to have security whenever you go into a public place. And obviously, that's very unpalatable for a number of reasons as well. That's not to say that we can't accomplish some goals with gun regulation. The real problem is not the occasional mass shooting, as horrible and as much as horrible as those things are, and I don't mean to diminish them in any way, shape, or form. But for every day in America, we have about 50 people who are shot, and so even though it's not a mass shooting, overall, there's a mass shooting every day in America if you think about the number of people who are shot and the number of people who are killed. And what we really need to do is come up with solutions that try to reduce the incidence of that kind of gun violence. We're not going to stop drunk driving, but we take steps to try to reduce drunk driving, and we can reduce gun violence. And things like universal background checks, I think, would be the kinds of things that can help bring down sort of the daily death toll of gun violence. But unfortunately, that daily death toll of gun violence doesn't really occupy much of our attention. It's these occasional mass shootings, which are obviously awful and wish they could go away. But they're not going anywhere anytime soon when you have so many guns in America and we're not getting rid of those guns.
I
Yeah,
think
go ahead, Jamel.
no, I was just gonna say. I mean, I think I take like on as a policy analysis, I think Adam is absolutely correct. But like on the level of politics, I think that message engenders cynicism. I think when people see a bunch of people get gunned down in a place of lowercase d democratic gathering, whether that's a shopping mall or a grocery store or whatever, public places, when people see that happen, and then they hear from policymakers and politicians that, oh, there's not really anything we can do about that. They say, well, then what's the point, right? And I think that that delta between the policy discussion and like the politics here is like the fact that that gap there creates a lot of cynicism. I just think it's like corrosive, even if there isn't a one-shot legislative solution to mass shootings. I think there's something so politically valuable for kind of creating some level of trust in the system for politicians to at least be able to concretely respond to these things with something, even if it is an open message that's sort of like, hey, this legislation may not prevent mass shootings, but it will go some level to preventing the more ordinary gun violence. Like simply saying that and using a mass shooting as the reason to pass it would be sort of like, I think, more constructive than what has happened in practice, which is this very, straightforward and intelligent policy analysis that says, not much we can do about this, absent getting rid of all the guns, which isn't going to happen. And then there's no movement on really anything after that. I do think that it is important politically for there to be some kind of connection between events and action. And when that connection does not exist, it makes people feel as if the political system cannot do anything. It makes it harder, in fact, I'd say, to do the kinds of policy work to deal with the more ordinary gun violence.
And I think it's the one thing I wanted to make sure we touched on is we're talking about this everyday gun violence, and it is a fact that we're in the third year of successive declines, historic declines, right? In a number of cities. We don't have, you're exactly right, Jamel, when you said there wasn't going to be any single legislative fix to mass shootings, nor is there a single legislative fix to what's commonly referred to as community gun violence. And yet we did see an amount of federal investment in sort of community grassroots level violence intervention programs, just investment in like state and local government through some of the COVID stimulus spending. And subsequent to that, a big and historic decline. And that barely registers. The decline it's a good thing. It's a good thing that's happening now. Maybe it's because it continues under Trump that Democrats don't want to talk about it. But the fact that that doesn't have more prominent political champions to say, we actually did do something. We had a historic spike in homicide during COVID, and then we drove it down to historic lows, right, in cities across the country. But it's been odd to me that doesn't have more traction as a political narrative and as a media narrative.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it may speak to the sort of the difficulties that especially Democrats have in this space talking about these issues. So much of the Democratic coalition does want more gun control as the way of reducing some of these problems. That this reduction in gun violence has come with the addition of 20 million gun sales every year in over that time period, with expansion of the right to bear arms, both in the Supreme Court striking down gun laws and in the lower court striking down gun laws, and also the expansion of the right to bear arms through legislation. Over that same period, we've seen, for instance, about half the states adopt new laws that eliminate permitting requirements for concealed carry on our public streets. And so what we've seen actually is these numbers drop at a time when gun rights are expanding and gun control is dropping. I don't think there's a cause and effect relationship necessarily there, but it does put Democrats at an awkward spot. There are ways that we can reduce gun violence. Some of that is through gun legislation. Things like universal background checks, I think, would help that. But a lot of the ways in which we're going to reduce gun violence in a society with 400 million guns is, like you say, through community intervention programs, research-based strategies that take the gun violence problem as a public health issue, and like a public health problem, not with the imagination you're going to eliminate it, but reduce it through research-backed innovations and interventions that can help identify those who are most likely to engage in gun violence and try to target those people with outreach or other ways in which we can make it less likely that they commit gun violence. It's just much less satisfying for people to see that as doing something, right? We have, in response to Jamelle, I think he's right about that. We have the sense that government's not doing anything. But we saw the government in the wake of these mass shootings increase significantly funding for community intervention programs. We've seen the majority of states adopt red flag laws, and the federal government adopt a law that provides funding for states to enhance red flag laws that enable people to go to court and try to take the guns out of the hands of people who are especially violent. We saw the federal government under the Trump administration ban bump stocks, subsequently overturned by the Supreme Court, by the way. And so it's not that we haven't seen anything, it's that we're not seeing the things that are going to satisfy the political coalition. And the things that are going to satisfy the political coalition might not have much of an effect on reducing gun violence. So it really is a conundrum that we're in, and makes it very difficult, I think, to pitch and to sell these efforts as successful interventions that work.
I'm going to go to questions from the audience. Thanks to all of you who have written in. Keep sending them. We'll get to as many as we can. This first one is from a Indiana University professor who teaches your book or uses your book, Adam, in his class. So you get this one first.
Thank you, by the way.
Yeah. He mentions, you talked about the rise in gun ownership during this period of decline. Reliable, objective data on gun ownership is extremely hard to come by, famously hard to come by, right? But some of the indications are that rise is driven in part by a rise in gun ownership among political liberals, right? Among women, racial and religious minorities, the LGBT community. Do you see the growth in gun ownership on the left, broadly speaking, right? We don't have hard numbers, but if we take that is a thing that is happening, could that change the politics? Could that help us out of this current bind at all?
I guess possibly, to the extent that that creates more pressure within the Democratic Party to recognize that the guns are here to stay, and that efforts to prohibit guns or eliminate the Second Amendment are not particularly fruitful. We still see this. I still hear this almost every time I give a talk on guns and gun policy in America. Why don't we overturn the Second Amendment? Even late Justice Stevens, before he passed, wrote an op-ed, I believe it was in the New York Times.
New York Times, yeah.
Yeah, I believe we needed to overturn the Second Amendment. And I think that this is, one of these ideas that is not likely to be very successful. Number one, we're not going to pass an amendment eliminating the Second Amendment, given the constitutional amendment process. In fact, given the amount of state support you need, right, 2/3 of both houses and then 3/4 of the states for a constitutional amendment, We're likely to see a constitutional amendment expanding gun rights more likely than we are to see one eliminating the Second Amendment, given the state of gun politics in America. But even regardless, even if you could get the Second Amendment overturned through a constitutional amendment, you still have all of these states that will allow guns to be possessed by Americans. And there's sort of a legal Second Amendment, the Second Amendment that's applied by the courts that strikes down some gun control laws. And then we have a political Second Amendment that's actually much stronger than the legal one and much more expansive. And we see it in
Hmm.
laws, for instance, like I mentioned earlier, that half the states have eliminated permitting requirements for concealed carry. Supreme Court's never said that you can't have permitting requirements. They've said the opposite. Bruin says you can have permitting requirements for concealed carry. Half the states have gotten rid of them. And that's a sign that the political Second Amendment, the idea of the Second Amendment as a political force that's leading to legislation at the state level, is very protective of gun rights and access to guns. And we need to get over the idea that the problem is the Second Amendment. If there is a problem with gun rights in America, it's a problem of the support for gun rights among American voters, and not about simply about the Supreme Court or how the court's interpreting the Second Amendment.
Um, I think that tees up another question we have from the audience, and I'll paraphrase here, but what then might reduce demand for guns, right? Within our current constitutional regime, with the Second Amendment, both as it applies legally, but Adam, you're so right, as a kind of a political force. Jamelle, what might need to change to change the demand? Are there, economic solutions that address some of the insecurity that may fuel a kind of masculine ideal around protector when the provider, identity is challenged? Is there something there?
Yeah, I do not know what it would take to reduce the demand for guns. Part of that's because, it's not that not every gun sale is a new person buying a gun, right? Like often
Of course.
gun sales are people who already own guns buying guns.
Their
This is
16th or 17th gun, yes,
right,
yeah.
right. This is a bit of a silly anecdote, but a couple years ago, do you remember back in Richmond, there was a big gun rights march in Richmond, Virginia, and I went just to cover it, and I brought, you can probably see them on my shelf back here, a lot of cameras. I brought a very old camera with me just to have fun with it. And I was talking to some of the guys about their guns, and they were talking to me about my cameras. And it dawned on me that like we were the same type of guy. Like um the same type of person interested in sort of like mechanics and gears and that kind of thing. And a lot of people who buy guns, a lot of guns, in the same way that a lot of people who buy lots of cameras, are not buying it for the first time. They're buying their seventh, eighth, ninth, tenth gun. In the same way that I have like, a dozen cameras on that shelf back there. Um, so you're not gonna, there's like for that kind of consumer, they're this is their hobby, right? And they're not gonna there's nothing you can do to reduce the incidence of them buying guns. For like new gun owners, some of that is driven by a sense of insecurity, but like that's often about the political environment, right? Like I'd be curious to see in the wake of National Guard occupations and ICE occupations, how many people self-identified liberal bought a gun. I'd be really interested to see how many bought a gun. Um, a sense of political insecurity, of political instability, uh, drives firearm purchases on both sides, right? And that is something, again, that I'm not sure how you affect, how you change, because it's purely subjective. Uh, so I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. Part of me wants to say that, this is just like the United States is a a gun culture and has been for its entire existence. And I don't really know if there is anything in particular one could do to get people to stop buying guns. Um, Whatever their intended use for them is, whether it's collecting, whether it's for sports, whether it's for hunting, whatever. This is just a culture where sort of like guns are common.
Yeah, just to add on, I mean, I completely agree with Jamel on this, and that part of that, the fact that so many shooters and gun owners are recreational shooters, and that it is a recreation that they really love, and most people are not possessing firearms because they have fear of criminal coming into their home, although that's part of it for sure. It's that they're hobbyists. They love to shoot in the way that my dad loves to play golf, and Jamel loves to carry cameras, and if you try to ban Jamel's camera, he's going to organize with other camera owners to stop that. And if
Yeah,
you
I'll
try to
buy a
ban,
gun.
yeah, if you try to, right, if you try to, yeah, exactly. If you try to take away my dad's new driver, he's gonna organize with other golfers and they're gonna fight against this because that's something that really unites them. And it's part of the difficulty for the gun control movement because they're not united in that same way over this recreation. And just like people in any of the major recreational sports are united by a variety of different things, websites that they go to, associations, they engage in the same activity. It's part of the reason why the gun rights movement is so strong. If you look historically, at least, if you want to know the answer to getting more gun control on the books, it's to have more African Americans, more disfavored minorities, Muslims, and others start owning guns and start carrying them around America's cities. Historically we've seen that's been the impetus for more gun control. When white people feel that minorities with guns are a threat, then we see gun legislation being passed over the course of American history. I'm not saying that that's about to happen, but that is a phenomenon that we have seen in the past. Ronald Reagan supported gun control when the Black Panthers were carrying guns on public streets. And so, in terms of the demand, I don't see us diminishing the demand anytime soon, but there are certainly these dynamics of the recreational shooting sports that help explain the strength of the gun rights movement.
I've got one more, and this synthesizes a couple of questions that have come in. We have a number of folks here who work in one way or another, either professionally, right, or as volunteers. They're working to reduce violence, reduce gun violence. Given the political realities, the state of the Supreme Court, everything we just established about both the kind of legal status of guns and the gun culture we have. What advice would you give folks who tuned in today as observers of politics and history about their work to reduce violence, right? To promote the safety itself, separate from the restrictions on the guns?
Well, I'll say if you want me to jump in first, I mean, I'd say so. First of all, if you want more gun legislation, you need to work to create more single issue pro regulation voters, and that you need to create a stronger political voting bloc that makes that the single issue that they base their vote on. We've seen some developments in this area. I mentioned earlier, Moms Demand Action has become an important part of the Democratic coalition, and I think you'd need to see more of that if you want to see more gun legislation. That might also lead to the appointment of more justices on the Supreme Court through the election of presidents and senators who support more gun regulation that will fight against the expansion of the Second Amendment that we've seen in the courts in recent years. Now, developments in these areas that we've seen over the last 20 years were not inevitable. They were the result of political activism and political mobilization. And the law of tomorrow will be the result of the political mobilizations that we have today. And so these things are not inevitable. If Roe versus Wade can be overturned by the Supreme Court, other decisions by the Supreme Court can as well. And so, if you want to see that be the result, I think the most important thing you could do is to really engage in that political mobilization to establish different boundaries, a different understanding, and a different political will in society.
Jamelle, we've got about a minute left. When, if ever, you allow yourself to feel optimistic, cautiously optimistic about a more peaceful future, a less violent future for America, where do you find the kind of roots of that hope and optimism?
I mean, this is going to sound like I'm avoiding the question, but I don't really think about things in terms of like optimism or hope, just sort of, you know, as we've discussed, there has been this decline in violence, right? Like it's not perceptions that the U.S. is a crime-ridden, hyper-violent country just like aren't true. Not only have there been meaningful declines in the level of violence in the country, um, it's probably safer to live in the United States today than it's been in like decades. So I think that just simple observation of the trend is enough to say to yourself, oh, things are probably going to improve as long as people continue to do the things that have led to improvement. Um, and then also, I mean, I'll just add to what Adam said that, like, in terms of political change, I mean, it ultimately is just a question of can you build the kind of political energy behind the things you want to see happen? I think it's really important to understand, as Adam said, that changes in a more conservative direction at the court and our politics are the function of bottom-up political activity. And bottom-up political activity can also be done to move things in the opposite direction.
Jamelle, thank you. Adam, thank you. We are at time. I really appreciated this conversation. I want to thank all of the attendees who wrote in with questions, everyone who spent time with us this afternoon. If you appreciate these virtual events, if you'd like to help us facilitate more conversations like this, there is a QR code there at the bottom. We are a reader-supported nonprofit newsroom, and every gift helps us keep doing this.